Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the slippery slope fallacy. This is basically a logical fallacy in which the worst possible outcome, or sometimes even an incredibly improbable or even impossible outcome, is presented as the likely result of a particular policy change. So if we do X, we will end up with this catastrophic result. That's basically the formula of the slippery slope. Why is it a problem? Because it's an inaccurate representation of the likely outcome of a particular policy. And so in that sense, it basically lies to your audience about what's likely to occur, right? If you're making an argument about whether or not a particular policy should be adopted, a particular change should be made, a particular decision should be taken, whatever it is, then you kind of owe your audience the truth about that context, right? Here's what will actually happen. Here's what we can really expect to occur if this decision is made. The slippery slope doesn't provide that. It misrepresents, it distorts what's likely to happen. So, I mean, one of the most egregious but unfortunately common examples of this I can think of in relatively recent contemporary US political discourse is the anti-gay marriage argument that if we allow same-sex marriage, then soon we'll be legalizing pedophilia and bestiality. This was made by fucking disgusting homophobes continually in the period prior to the legalization of same-sex marriage in the US. And first off, it was never a logical outcome. It was never a likely outcome. It was never a likely consequence of legalizing same-sex marriage. Of course, it has not happened since same-sex marriage was legalized, which was now quite a while ago. And it's also worth noting that it reflects more on the way that the people making this argument think about what marriage is than it does on same-sex couples, but that's a different story. But this was used as a fear tactic, right? Oh, we can't do this thing because the outcome will be catastrophic, even though there was no logical reason to ever think that that outcome would follow. So this is essentially the basis of the slippery slope fallacy, is if this often relatively minor thing, relatively mild thing, relatively inconsequential thing in terms of negative outcomes. I mean, obviously same-sex marriage was very consequential for LGBT people, but in terms of negative outcomes for the world, the country, society in general, it really doesn't have many. I mean, divorce rates among LGBT people went up, but that's sort of necessity. If people can get married, they're more likely to get divorced, just in the same way that the number one cause of death is birth. But again, this is the sort of thing, right? Is it doesn't give your audience an accurate impression of what the likely outcomes of a particular decision are. You could make an argument against same-sex marriage on the basis of any number of things. You could argue that marriage itself is a flawed institution because it is rooted in ideas of property relationships and treating other people as your property, whatever it is. You could argue that there are negative social consequences to monogamy. Fine. Okay, good. Make those arguments if you want to. You may or may not convince people, but you can make a good faith argument about that. But to say that same-sex marriage is going to lead to people having sex with children or animals being legalized fundamentally misrepresents possible outcomes of this decision. And again, it is used as a scare tactic, and so in that sense, it is not meant to provide an honest, reasonable assessment of the situation. It is therefore fundamentally untrustworthy. Sometimes the slippery slope fallacy is easy to spot. Sometimes it will be quite egregious. Other times it won't necessarily be quite as egregious because people will try and create a logical chain of events that would lead to the outcome they're claiming. And sometimes that can be persuasive. A lot of times it isn't, though. And part of the reason it ends up not being, or part of the way it ends up not being, is that if you actually scrutinize the argument, you can typically tell, okay, well, here's where your reasoning falls apart. Here's the thing that you're saying. Here's the step that you're missing that would be logically required for this sequence of events to make sense.